Welcome to the Animal Training Fundamentals Podcast, where we have fun with practical application and we get mental with the science of behavior. Put them both together and you get results, solutions for your behavior problems, and the tools you need to achieve your training goals. I'm your host, Barbara Heidenreich. Let's talk training. Hey, animal training enthusiast. I'm so happy to have you here because I have got a great episode for you. Dr. Joe Layng is my guest, and he is my favorite behavior analyst, and you're going to hear all the reasons why in the episode, so I'm not going to go into it now. But I want to tell you about some resources I have for you featuring his work. He's got a new article coming out in the latest issue of Operance magazine from the B.F. Skinner Foundation, and this is a free publication you can get just by going to the B.F. Skinner Foundation website, and I'll have a link for that on the episode webpage. And it's a great article all about the emotions in the time of a pandemic beyond cognition and behavior. It's a really fascinating article because it really helps you think about emotions in a different way. So I encourage you to go get that article. And then you're also going to be able to find another article about coercion without aversive stimuli. And this is kind of a synopsis of a presentation that Dr. Joe Layng did at the recent Art and Science of Animal Training Conference. And again, you'll be able to find those links on the episode webpage. Now, I'm also going to answer one of your training questions this time, and this one is about harness training coati. So that's going to be at the end of the podcast. I don't want to delay any further because this interview was gold. So much great information in this episode. So let's get into it. Dr. Joe Layng. Oh, I'm super excited today to have Dr. Joe Layng. Just so you know, you are my absolute favorite behavior analyst. I tell people this all the time. So welcome.
Well, thank you. And then you must know 3 behavior analysts.
No, that's not true. That's not true at all.
The other 2 must not be very fun.
No, I'm going to tell you why you are my favorite. Now, it's not only because of your knowledge, which is enormous, and you're going to tell us a little bit about your background in just a moment, because I will ask you, but I think it's because you're very generous with your information, and you have an incredible amount of information, but you're also very down to earth and approachable, and the way that you share it is so kind, because you have so much information, and it could be very easy for you to just be like, oh, well, you're never going to get it because you're so far behind. Because I know I have a lot to learn, but you're very kind about how you share it and help people understand. But also at the same time, I think you're so respectful of the people that are out there training animals and what we do, because it seems to me like you also feel like it's really cool what animal trainers do. So that's what I appreciate. There seems to be sort of this mutual respect going on, and I'm very grateful for that. So thank you very much for being kind to us animal trainers who are out there trying to learn.
Thank you for that. And I just have to say, I've learned a great deal from animal trainers, believe me, over the course of the years since I began going to animal training conferences. And I've been going more and more over the years because I always learn more there than I do at the typical behavior analysis conferences, truthfully. And more exciting, people asking really interesting questions, pushing the envelope in what they can do, and always with a great heart, at least to the conferences I attend. I understand there are some approaches that are not as friendly as others, but I don't know anything about that, so I won't get into that. But the ones that I attend, the real concern and love for the animals and trying to do best, but yet a rigorous procedures and trying to understand the basis of those procedures and why things work under certain conditions has really been intriguing to me. And so I have more than a little respect. I have a great deal of respect for everyone in the animal training world, and particularly since I never bother to train my animals. I just let them train me.
I think a lot of animal trainers can say that about their own animals. We're probably as guilty as that as well. So why don't you go ahead and share with everyone your background? Because it is really very fascinating. I think that's one of my favorite things about talking with you at these conferences, because you do have such an amazing background.
Well, my wife once said, after reviewing I think it was my curriculum vitae or a resume or something I was doing. This was some years ago. And she looked at it and she said, one could take two approaches, two opinions away from this. I said, really? What's that? Well, you either have a wealth of experience or you can't hold a job. so this is basically what it is. I have done throughout the area of the basic and applied analysis of behavior. I have done many, many, many things. I began in the area of instructional design, programmed instruction. Actually was my first foray into behavior analysis after reading original works of Skinner and so forth. I was introduced to it in a community college course in let's see, how long ago was it? It was 51 years ago. So I've been doing this and I read an article by John B. Watson, actually, and I said, well, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, and that was it. And I often say I'm really thankful that B.F. Skinner came along because Watson had been dead for many years, which I didn't know when I read the article. Although if I'd have looked and saw it was written in 1913, I might have figured it out. But because without Skinner, I may have had to have a job, had to really work for a living. But I found something I loved and could apply to anything, no matter what it was I was doing. And so that's what I began doing. I began in the area of programmed instruction, instructional design, and then in the area of psychiatry. I worked a great deal in clinical behavior analysis. And then I worked in the animal laboratories. My dissertation, which I did at the University of Chicago in biopsychology, actually, was with pigeons. And I did a lot of rat work and pigeon work and so forth. So I was, the typical behavioral investigator in terms of, working in the animal laboratory, as well as working in the clinic and working in large-scale organizations to help them improve. We worked in hospitals and medical centers, implementing programs throughout for thousands of people. So whether it was one pigeon or 1,000 humans, to me, I'd see a person walking down the hallway and they just look like a big pigeon with no feathers. And and when I looked at pigeons, I just saw a little person with feathers. So it was seamless for me. And so I spent many years doing this, and then eventually I founded software companies, and that's how I made a living and applied all of these procedures to the design of software primarily to teach children and so on. But at the same time, I kept up my toe in all areas of biology, and then as well as applied work in clinical areas. And I also then kept my toe into emerging areas since I was in the software area. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on have all been kind of mixing around and so forth. And when you talk about having a great deal of knowledge about something, the more you get, the more you understand how much you don't have. Israel Goldiamond, who was my mentor and friend and teacher, once said to me, the universe of things we don't know will always exceed that universe which we do. And so it's a very humbling thought when you think about that. So the fact that someone knows something or doesn't know something is, that's a given, right? It's not something that one really needs to comment on. I mean, it's just the nature of the world and all the information in it. And I try to keep up on areas, and I'm also interested in the philosophy of the science of behavior, and I'm also interested in philosophy in general. So that's me. Hopefully that makes some sense.
You skipped a couple of things, though, that I remember we've talked about. Didn't you once read like every journal?
Yes. Well, when I started out, I remember, if you remember that article in 1969 that I read, by the way, it was 2 a.m. in the Hollywood restaurant in February of 1969. So I remember the very moment it happened, by the way, that I became a behaviorist of sorts. But I was very interested in the area, And first book I read was Skinner's book on verbal behavior. And then I realized there was a whole science behind it, and I heard about, through some source, about the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. And it began, its first issue was in 1958, and this was 1969. So I read all 11 years back issues of the journal. I started from the beginning and read all the way through. Now, I didn't understand every word of it. I'll be the first to admit that. But when I didn't, I went and tried to figure it out. And since I knew I could go back to the experiments that I'd read to try to figure out what they were talking about in later ones. Now, today it would be more difficult to do that because there are many decades more issues. Luckily, there was only 11 years, and I think it came out every couple of months. So there weren't that many to read. So it sounds like a bigger feat than it actually was. But
I don't know.
the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis had only been out for a year. So that was really easy.
You're always good at referring me to good journal articles. So I always think of you as sort of the encyclopedia of referrals to journal articles.
Well, truthfully, that helped me in graduate school a great deal, because not for my own work, but people would come to me all the time. So I became, rather a critical piece. They'd say, Joe, what was that? Wasn't there an article on this? And I'd think about it for a minute. I could usually remember where in that time span, and I'd kept up reading the journals. So, it was easier to keep up after that period. Now all I had to do was keep up, not go through it. So I was like the walking reference source.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of maintained. Usually when someone mentions something, I can usually figure out where to go to. Either I can know the source or I know where to go to get it. So.
And then another piece that I remember is, don't you have an interesting story about getting into grad school?
Well, I barely got into grad school. I never really. I flunked out of undergrad twice, but I had a strange career in that even though I flunked out, I became director of a Center for Innovative Design and Program Instruction at Western Illinois University. I did that for 2.5 years and was there under with large grants and so on, and got to know the president of the university very well and so forth. And we had a staff of 23 people. We programmed over 19 university courses and so forth. And then I went and got a position at the Institute of Psychiatry at Northwestern University's Northwestern Memorial Hospital Center, their medical center. And I became a mental health worker there. And then I became a head of a research treatment group. And I started teaching courses in behavior analysis for psychiatric residents. I had no bachelor's degree. So so eventually I ended up getting a life experience degree from the Board of Governors of State Universities of Illinois. So a legitimate place. It wasn't, off the back of a cornflakes box or something. But it was a legitimate. But I also got a master's degree at the University of Houston Clear Lake, where they let me in just as a matriculated student, where I could take courses, but they didn't count toward anything. And then finally, when I got the life experience degree, then they all retroactively counted. So I received my undergraduate degree in in December of 1978, and my master's degree in May of 1979. So it was just like 5 months later, 6 months later, I had a master's degree because I had these retroactive courses, and I'd already done my research there. I'd had many research projects. We published and did all sorts of things there, and I built a lab there, animal labs. It was almost all animal work, although my master's degree was in human. Most of the other people I helped was in the animal lab there, often with doing psychopharmacology work as well. But but I'd wanted to go to the University of Chicago. I wanted to work with Israel Goldiamond, and I applied to the university, and it was the only place I applied to. And my undergraduate GPA was a 1.1, and so it was not exactly the type of student that they typically admitted to the University of Chicago, which typically admitted people from Ivy League and other similar places into the program. They're a very rigorous program. And I applied, and of course, the Committee on Biopsychology met, And they looked at me and they just laughed and said, "Is this guy crazy?" And they threw it away. But Israel Goldiamond, who I'd come to know and who had invited me to sit in on his courses when I was in Chicago and so forth, actually he was a paraplegic, and he took his wheelchair and he actually wedged himself into the door, into the room, and said, "I'm sorry, but no one leaves until he's admitted."
Wow.
And I want him. And so if you want to go home tonight, you're going to have to agree to admit it. So they finally gave in after some complaining and no money. and they admitted me. And that's how I got into the University of Chicago. That was, it was good. I got in, and Izzy Goldiamond said, well, now here's your job. You have to get all A's, and you have to do extremely well, not because of for you, but so that if another student comes along who I vouch for, they'll admit him. If you don't work out, they won't. So you're not doing this for you, you're doing this for the next person. And so that was the burden I carried, and so I had to do really well, and I was very appreciative. And I'll tell you a true story. I don't know if I've told people this before in a podcast or ever, is that every spring at the university, when the grass would come green and so on, I'd go to the quad, I'd kneel down and kiss the ground before the actual opportunity they gave me to come to that wonderful school. And they actually had to force me out after 15 years.
Wow.
I spent 15 years in graduate school. I love that place.
Wow.
They had to threaten me to leave. They had to threaten with having me to retake all the coursework, and said, "No, I don't want to do that." So I wrote my dissertation in 3 weeks. That wasn't the problem. I just love the place.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it was a magical place to me. I had so much fun, and I loved graduate school, and I loved the challenge, and I loved taking courses for which I was totally unprepared. I had no background in biopsychology whatsoever. When I was in my coursework, it was like they were speaking some foreign language. It could have been Mandarin for all I know, and I had to go look up the words they were using and so forth. But it worked out, and I did well. And I did some interesting research. I was able to do a great deal of clinical work. I got to hang out with Israel Goldiamond, who basically, along with Susan Markle and Philip Tiemann at the University of Illinois, were my mentors who shaped and trained me. So I am who I am today because of them.
Wow. Wow. That's such a cool story. I'm sort of at a loss for words now. I have to think of the next question to even ask.
Well, you asked me.
I know. That was a good question. It led to some really good answers there. Kind of, I'm trying to think now with the Israel Goldiamond there of how it leads into some of these things we wanted to talk about, because it is really, I mean, a lot of the stuff there is the things he talked about, right? As far as the nonlinear approach.
Correct.
This whole system of least intrusive, most positive, right? And setting those guidelines for the industry and how to do behavior intervention strategies. So who were the people, or where did all that come from? Who came up with all that? Where do we get those?
Sounds like somebody who runs a good marketing campaign. Here's the problem. If I can start back a little bit and talk about some of these things. When Skinner was first developing the terminology around this, for him, positive and negative did not refer to good or bad.
Yeah.
The words positive in mathematics has a different meaning than a positive attitude, right? And so his was more of the mathematical one. For him, positive simply meant adding, and negative was basically subtracting, right? Mm-hmm. It had no connotation of one being preferable over the other, or one being better than the other, or one being good and one not being good. And what people often fail to understand when they hear negative reinforcement, they say, "Oh, we don't want to do a negative thing." But removing things which animals or others find aversive or would like to terminate in some way is not necessarily a bad thing.
Mhm.
I mean, you go to the dentist, right? And you're a happy camper when you leave that dentist, and that's all negative reinforcement, right?
Mhm.
And so uh, uh, so we also fail to understand that positive is simply means the adding of something. When we talk about it in terms of reinforcement, it's talking about a consequence contingent on behavior. But oftentimes we don't look at the broader context of how that's occurring and what makes us able to do that. And so people fail to realize that experiments have been run in the operant laboratory whereby we can take a painful electric shock and under the right program, we can get an animal to work for it as positive reinforcement. No other food available, nothing like that. No, no tricking the animal in that sense of, you have to be shocked to get the food. They've done that too. And there's some interesting things about that too I could talk about. But by and large, you can make it so that an animal will work to escape or postpone a shock on one lever in a chamber, and on another lever, work to produce the same shock.
Mhm. So the shock is the actual reinforcer.
The shock is the actual reinforcer.
Okay.
But I'm sure if you were to ask that animal, what do you think about this shock? They're not going to be very happy about it, right?
Mhm.
So it's not positive, although it's a positive reinforcer.
Right.
The fact that something is contingent upon something else being presented doesn't necessarily make it pleasant. And I think that's what we have to divorce ourselves from, the notion of positive and pleasant, negative and aversive, right? A dog that barks and chases the mailman away every day.
Mhm.
Someone says, why does the dog bark at the mailman? Because it works. The mailman goes away every day, right? Well, how do you know that dog? My dog, when does it, is wagging his tail and as happy as can be. Oh boy, I did it again today. I got rid of that guy. That's great. Well, that's negative reinforcement for barking, right? From that point of view of that dog.
Mhm.
And that dog's probably thrilled with the fact that it drove that mailman away one more time. So this notion that somehow the procedures are tied to affect in a particular one-to-one way. Now, there may be general rules that we can look at. It's better to present than to remove aversive stimuli in certain situations. But there's a difference here. And one is, are we superimposing contingencies on those that already exist? That's one of the questions that have to be asked, in which similar typically are not. In essence, often if a behavior is occurring at any frequency, it's usually occurring because of some type of reinforcer involved, either positive or negative. In other words, a reinforcer, is a stimulus when made contingent on behavior will increase the frequency of that class of behavior over time. Well, the notion that a behavior is occurring at a high frequency, we have to look at what's going on in the organism's world of why that's occurring. And when we do that, we find that there are already contingencies operating. But we want the animal to do something else. So what we're doing is coming in, taking another reinforcer that's probably different from the one maintaining the pattern, and superimposing it on the contingency that already exists there. Now, we see this in the studies on punishment really clearly. So what they'll do is they'll take an animal and they'll have it press a lever on a schedule which reinforces the first response after a particular interval of time has elapsed. And that time usually varies by some amount. It's called a variable interval schedule.
Okay.
And it makes a nice, steady pattern of behavior. But it allows the animal to decrease the frequency of responding and increase it without too much affecting the reinforcement rate. So it allows variability in the behavior. And so we take that now, and now we superimpose, let's say, an electric shock or another aversive stimulus, and we see that the rate of lever pressing drops. And if it's a potent enough stimulus, aversive stimulus, the rate will drop to almost zero or zero. We remove it and it comes back.
Remove the
You say,
punishment.
look at that. Punishment suppresses behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're ignoring, of course, is that there's an underlying variable interval schedule upon which the punishment has been superimposed. And in our lab, and it's published, a research was shown that they did the same thing. They took a variable interval schedule reinforcement and then superimposed on top of it a continuous reinforcement schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, the behavior dropped in frequency because the frequency of behavior under CRF is much lower than under VI. And it showed that it could suppress responding with positive reinforcement, superimposed upon another positive reinforcement schedule. When they removed the CRF, the behavior bounced back. Right? In essence, the underlying contingency was still in place. And so the question is, are our positive reinforcement procedures simply suppressing the behavior being maintained by the natural reinforcers in the environment? And sometimes those natural reinforcers can be negative reinforcers, and sometimes they can be positive reinforcers. But unless that natural environment basically has been rearranged, there's a high probability that behavior will return, or you'll have to be continually vigilant, right? If you've trained your dog to, under certain circumstances, to ignore that squirrel going by, well, under those conditions, when you're not there presenting the stimuli, bing, they're after the squirrel, right? and all you've done is suppress the behavior of chasing the squirrel. You haven't really altered that contingency. That contingency, squirrels chase it, run after it, get closer, and have a good run and have fun, is there. So the notion that positive reinforcement is always a good thing has to be in the broader contingency context of what is going on in the animal's world. And sometimes that world involves things like distancing, getting things away. And doing that, one can respect that. And that's where the constructional affect training, constructional aggression training comes in that you're giving the animal what it is getting anyhow, but you're doing it in such a way that it can be successful, but yet approaching the behavior that is going to be beneficial in some other way as well, such as taking medications and different types of diets and changes and examinations and so forth that can occur in a zoo environment. So the animal is actually not having a positive reinforcement contingency superimposed, such as I like to drive that person away, but I also like getting this food.
Mm-hmm.
This type of thing, the food's gone, or I'm going to be back at driving away. Well, whereas the cat procedure, you typically can then walk up with no food in your hand and administer the medicine or whatever, and then reinforce with food as well. In other words, you can establish other contingencies. And there's a difference there that is not often understood, is that you can, once those are met, other things become available because the animal can now engage in a variety of other responses. They're not focused in on you approaching, and keeping an evil eye on you, as well they should. And so these are the types of context that we have to understand, positive and negative and reinforcers. And it's not as simple as, I use, the least unpleasant. Well, unpleasant is something we don't know. And I would guess is that it's not a good basis for planning our procedures as well. It's much more to say, what are the natural contingencies this animal is responding to? How can I respect that? And how can I offer my procedures in the context of that operating contingencies as they are occurring?
Mm. Yeah, and so that ties into one of my other questions. I think you kind of answered it right there, is that basically at times positive reinforcement could be, quote, more aversive than negative reinforcement, depending on the circumstances.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can superimpose reinforcement contingencies on people that are. Let's back up a little bit.
Okay.
Um,
and they're overlapping, as you're saying.
Yeah. Behavior typically has more than one consequence. And we talked earlier about the natural occurring consequences in an environment and so forth. And so if you are a prisoner in a penitentiary somewhere, and I come to you and say, Barbara, you're in here for 10 years. You probably deserve 20, but they only gave you 10. But you're in here for 10 years. If you enroll in this medical research experiment, I'll knock 8 years off your sentence. You only have to serve 2, not 10. Well, that's positive reinforcement. But then I look at the side effects of this drug, this medical treatment. Oh my God, you could go bald, bleed out of your ears. I don't know if you ever watch those commercials on TV where they talk about all the side effects of the drugs and so on. And you look at this and go, oh my God, I could be miserable, I could be killed, I could be maimed, but boy, I'd love to get these 8 years off my sentence. And so you say, okay, I'll do it. Now, if I came to you and said, Barbara, I'd really like for you to engage in this medical experiment, I'll give you 8 years off. Or if you agree to work in the prison library and go through and help us with the books and deliver them out and read through them and catalog them and so on, we know you've got great organizational skills and so on. We'll knock 8 years off your sentence as well. You can choose either one. My guess is you would choose the library. Why? Because the amount of work from going into the library every day has to be compared against the possible life-threatening consequences of the medication. Now, those consequences can now have their effect because the critical consequence, right, the 8 years off the prison sentence, is equal across those two alternatives. So what happens is that we can come in contact with those consequences. Oftentimes when we use positive reinforcement, we are giving only one way to get that critical consequence. And then when we do that, we are eliminating what we call the degrees of freedom. And we use the term degrees of freedom much the same as using statistics. N minus 1 equals the number of the degrees of freedom. So if you have two alternatives, n is 2 minus 1, you have 1 degree of freedom. If you have 3 minus 1 is 2 degrees of freedom. So in the case of the prison example there, you have 1 degree of freedom. In the case where you can do the library or the medical treatment. On the other hand, if it's just the medical treatment, you have 0 degrees of freedom. In a sense, you're coerced with positive reinforcement into doing something that you otherwise would not do. And so oftentimes we can take these positive reinforcement. Food is a great example. Deprive an animal of food, make it highly potent. You can get them to do just about anything. You can, an animal whose leg is injured will work and jump and so forth on that injured leg in ways they wouldn't otherwise if there's a potent food reinforcer connected to it. In other words, the natural consequence of jumping, what happens when they hit the ground, cannot have its effect the same way. So what we find is that if one is limiting the critical consequence to a particular class of behavior, then we are coercing that class. And that, now, there are times when you live with coercion, right? And when we're teaching kids to read, basically we're coercing them into reading to a certain extent. So the question isn't necessarily, are you coercing or not? It's how much coercion and how many degrees of freedom are we offering? And so the question then is how do we close and open up alternatives to consequences for our animals? And what are the trade-offs involved in doing so? So the question isn't really that negative reinforcement, if you will, the termination of a stimulus upon which, aversive stimulus, that occasions an aversive stimulus. Here's an interesting piece too, is that in the laboratory, they'll take a stimulus and they'll pair it with electric shock, for example. So one would assume that since it's paired with electric shock, the stimulus itself becomes a condition aversive event. But what you'll find is that if that stimulus occurs and the animal is allowed to respond, and that response then terminates or postpones the shock, the animal will work to produce that stimulus. In other words, it's not aversive. Because that stimulus means, hey, I get out of this situation. Right? Hey, I can avoid this shock. Give me that. I'd rather have that signal that tells me I need to get out of here. And they will work to produce it. So if you're just looking at the stimulus part of it, it's positive reinforcement. And what's more, as an animal on another lever, you can give the animal a choice. Unsignaled shock or signaled shock. A response will terminate both. But on this lever, if I press it, I get the signal. The animals will press like crazy to get the signal. Yeah. So that signal is not a condition aversive event. That signal is a reinforcing event. In the sense of they'll work to produce it, right? So these things are fairly complex, but in a way, very logical and understandable. You want to know, you want a warning, right? You want to know if it's slippery when wet. That sign's not aversive. I'll work to produce that sign, right?
That actually kind of, again, thinking as the practical application person, it makes me think so much about when we just train for injections. We usually teach a signal that means we're about to poke you with the needle.
Right.
And so I'm thinking in terms of like, oh yeah, all right, that justifies our teaching touch. We usually say touch before we poke with the needle. And our explanation is that it's good to give the animal information that you're about to get stuck with the needle. Yeah. So I'm going to use that now.
The notion of alternatives is really important here. And what is actually a behavioral alternative and what is not, and so forth. There's a little confusion in that area. If I have a rat in an operant laboratory and it's pressing a lever, and it takes its little paw and it puts on the lever and it presses down and exerts enough force that closes a micro switch. That micro switch oscillates the solenoid, which then causes the food hopper magazine to operate. And you hear a clunk, because that's the organization. That's basically like your clicker from the animal's point of view. Yeah. The clunk. That means the pellet is dropping in the food, or in a pigeon's case, the magazine is raising up and it'll stay up for 3 seconds so the animal can eat. And the animal hearing the clunk will walk over to the food magazine, either get the pellet or eat the food for the 3 seconds. When finished, the animal will walk over and begin pecking again, or begin pressing the lever again, in the case of a rat. But this rat can use one hand, it can use its right paw, it can use its left paw, it can use both paws. It can take its head and close the levers, and I've had rats who sat on the lever to actually close it, right? All of those have the same function, meaning that they're closing the micro switch. And so those behaviors that meet the same criteria are put in the same behavioral class. And what's interesting about those is that if we do one procedure to one of those behaviors, it tends to affect all the other behaviors in that class. And so that's what defines a behavioral class. You do one thing to one element of the class and it affects the other elements in either a stimulus class or a response class. We're talking about a response class here. Now, a food pellet is dropping, right? As a function of closing the micro switch. But now I'm watching my cumulative record, which shows, my rate of responding and my reinforcers are occurring. And I watch and I look and I see the rate now just drops right off. I said, oh, food's no longer a reinforcer for this animal. The rate had just dropped right off. But then I go and I peer in the chamber, I look inside, and what do I see? That dog, and this happens, by the way, this rat's got his hand up into the dispenser, and he shakes it. And sure enough, a pellet drops out. Eats it, shakes it. A pellet drops out. The food is still a reinforcer.
But the response isn't required.
It's much easier to reach up and get that shake that top, right? Well, that's not in the same class of behaviors because it is not closing that micro switch. In other words, it's not the actual consequence that defines the function. It's the requirement placed on the animal to provide that consequence, and that defines the function. Okay. So what I have is a real alternative behavior, and that's what defines alternative behaviors rather than behaviors that are different that are in the same class.
Okay.
So shaking, I have to shake at a certain level of force in order to dislodge the food. That's one set of criteria. Yeah. Pressing a lever to close a micro switch is a different one, both producing the same consequence, but one can supplant the other. And so we often talk about something being functionally equivalent. Well, there's two ways of looking at that. Functionally, in terms of meeting the same criteria, what do we allow the animal to do to meet the criteria we're imposed on it, versus what way does the animal have of going around us and getting the other food. So if an animal finds a way of reaching into the next cage very craftily and stealing food, and all of a sudden our food procedures seem not to work, we say, oh, this food is no longer a reinforcer. Now the animal's just found another way to get it, right? Yeah. And so this is what we mean by alternative behaviors. And oftentimes, that's what we need to look at in terms of, in the clinic, that's what we look at in terms of saying, okay, how can I get that reinforcer for the person, but maybe through meeting other criteria? Mm-hmm. What alternative can I do? I'm not trying to substitute a behavior for the micro switch. Although sometimes that works because it may be easier to press with one right paw rather than sit on it. I might end up being easier. So if I can demonstrate that to the animal, it will work. So there are times when you use that type of thing. But by and large, clinically, what we're looking for is saying, okay, how can I increase the degrees of freedom? And that's what we mean now, that rat, shaking or pressing, has 1 degree of freedom in that chamber. When I take away, I fix that magazine so shaking no longer works. I've removed a degree of freedom. The animal is coerced into lever pressing for positive reinforcement. If this makes any sense.
Yeah, no. So I think what I'm thinking about in practical application in my world, an example that comes to mind often is like we might have an animal that somebody wants to shift off of exhibit into their holding area. Mm-hmm. And the animal's not shifting, maybe because it's been trapped in there before, the door's been shut on it against their will, and so the animal has a fear response to shifting. And so what people will do is they'll put the food in that space, and they'll basically say, well, you're not going to get to eat unless you go into that space.
There you go.
So
yeah.
That's it, and so and so the animal really has to overcome this huge fear response that has to be so hungry that it's willing to go in there, and that's the only way that it's going to get food.
That's right. It's coerced in there, and it's superimposed upon the contingencies that are existing. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, and there's no other options to get food.
No other option for that animal, right?
Yeah.
And so that is, and my guess is if you ask the animal about the pleasantness of all of that experience, he would not report being that positive reinforcement experience is all that pleasant.
Exactly.
And this is where I see in some of the so-called counter conditioning things. These are superimposition types of procedures where you're not dealing with the natural distancing contingencies. You're superimposing something to overcome them, to suppress the behavior in essence. You're increasing one, but you're really trying to suppress the other. Mm-hmm. And so and this is why I'm not sure that if you were to get a self-report, I try to put myself, when working with clients, human clients, in their shoes and say, well, how would I respond to this? And I look at that and say, well, that wouldn't make me very happy. And I know I'm a really sensible person. So they're obviously being very sensible by not being happy. And I tend to look at that for animals as well. In other words, really? Is that, would I be really happy in that situation? No. Would I find that pleasant? No. And then the other hand, people forget is that we have humans that do crazy stuff. They do things like go mountain climbing. They climb up rock cliffs and so on. There is a tremendous number of aversive stimuli that they are escaping continually on their journey. And actually that release from danger, if you want to call it that, is the main reinforcer maintaining that behavior. Overcoming that challenge, release from that danger. You can be a very powerful reinforcer. And so and actually they'll pay thousands and thousands of dollars for the opportunity for even greater challenges and even greater release from danger.
Is that why people do roller coasters too?
Yeah, it's interesting because they say, well, it's to get to the top. I say, really? Why don't you just take a helicopter and have it drop you off at the top? In other words, it'd probably be cheaper, a heck of a lot safer, just to be dropped off at the top, right? If being at the top is a reinforcer, you can get that. So obviously that's not the reinforcer, right? And we also have to look at and try to not make, snap judgments about things. I use an example of, I love refried beans. I have to admit, I just bought a case from Costco. It's being delivered today, actually. And so I'm cooking my beans on the stove, right? And I've got a pan that's got a metal handle. And I go, oh, wait, I can't touch that handle because it's really hot. But I can't get my beans out. I can't stir them. So I take a glove, one of these oven mitts, and I put it on and I grab the handle and I stir my beans and I put it on my plate, right? And I'll ask someone, I'll say, well, what maintains putting on the glove? And they'll say, oh, it's negatively reinforced by removing the burning, right? Removing the opportunity to be burned. I say, really? If I wanted to remove the opportunity to be burned, all I have to do is turn off the fire and walk away. If that's the reinforcer, why don't I just turn off the fire and walk away? It's not the reinforcer. The reinforcer is getting the beans. It's something I have to do as part of my sequence, my chain, if you will, in order to get the beans. Now, what makes me choose a glove under that circumstance is that touching with bare hands is punished.
Punishing, yeah.
But that's not what's governing the glove. That's what's governing the reducing in frequency of touching. So I have multiple contingencies operating. One is reduced frequency of touching with a bare hand. But now I have multiple degrees of freedom of how to achieve that particular avoiding of the punishment, right, of the aversive event. I don't have to put on a glove to avoid it. So putting on the glove is maintained strictly by the beans. And so sometimes what we call negative reinforcement, it really isn't. And we don't look at what would happen to us if we didn't put it on. And so that's where what we call a nonlinear analysis comes in. When we have to look at the alternative contingencies that are operating at any one time that jointly work together to determine behavior.
Yeah.
So contingencies act together to produce an outcome. So this is what we're talking about in terms of the
nonlinear.
The nonlinear approach. In that two things are occurring. One is, so if I'm looking at the operant chamber and my rate of lever pressing is dropping, I can't necessarily assume that that is no longer a reinforcer until I check and see if the behavior, another behavior is producing that food pellet or food in general, right?
Yeah.
So I have to look at that. So it might not be deprivation that's causing it, it's satiation rather, that's causing it, or it's lost its sense of taste or something all of a sudden. It can be that there is an alternative there.
And
And
that things are happening at the same time, which
right,
is the other thing that I think I've been thinking a lot about as well, is that it seems everything is occurring at the same time. Not everything, but many principles are occurring at the same
right.
time.
That's exactly right. And and the and we don't always see them because remember, it's not the consequences that are occurring now that is determining the behavior. It's the consequences that occurred in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So we are always under control of what happened to us before. What is going to happen to us is going to govern what's going to happen to us in what we do in the future, because that will then be the past. But only what happened to us. So you can say, well, I'm not doing anything related to that alternative behavior now. No, but what happened yesterday? I go into that door and my thing falls and hits me on the head. So I don't want to go inside there. You say, but there's nothing harmful in there. Well, you don't know what happened 2 days ago or last month, right? So it is not what's going to happen right now that is going to govern the behavior. In the Matrix, the Oracle, it says, "Am I going to take the candy?" And the Oracle says, "Well, you know the answer to that decision. You've already made your decision." He goes, "Well, if I already made my decision, what am I doing here? Why bothering all this?" He said, "Well, you should have figured it out by now. Your idea is not to make a decision; it's to figure out why you made it."
Mm-hmm.
And so the decision is already made when you made your decision. The question is, what happened to you in the past that resulted in that decision now? It's not what's going to happen to you. What I think about in terms of what's going to occur in the future, what I think about in that is all a function of what's occurred to me in the past, not what's going to happen in the future. And so clinically, that's an extremely important thing for people to understand. And that the decisions they're making today is made upon the life they led yesterday.
So I've had this other thought that I'd like to run by you as well, because I was, again, thinking about, how we were talking about the constructional approach. And when we think about something like negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement, when people talk about, say, negative reinforcement, there has been this image that, negative reinforcement, it's, an animal potentially moving away from aversive. And so that must create this, escape response. And it could be perceived as this really strong response. Yet when we talk about the application of CAT, we're usually talking about something very, almost imperceptible if we're applying it in the way that we would like to. So it made me think about, for a visual for myself, I kind of made like a pyramid, and that maybe using something like the constructional approach would be a very benign approach, and that maybe there could be a version of negative reinforcement that could be, let's say, coercive. So there's sort of a benign version and a coercive. So it's more like a pyramid. Maybe within negative reinforcement, we have this, this whole spectrum, of how it can be applied. And maybe we have that within all of our procedures, that there's this range of benignness and coerciveness depending on all these different factors. Is that possible? Is that how we might want to?
Well, there are no givens about positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. In essence, they can be unpleasant or pleasant, either one.
Mm.
The idea of an electric shock maintaining behavior as a positive reinforcer is probably not the most pleasant experience in the world, right? On the other hand, moving something away in CAT, like, I'm successful, might be a big positive thing, right? So it is not necessary, and it actually gives control. And I've worked with people with phobias and so on this. It gives them control over their environment, by the way. They feel control over it. If you look at things like desensitization, where you walk, and people confuse this with the CAT procedures, and that you walk up and you stay and the animal gets calm and then you get closer. In other words, you haven't moved away. Well, what you're doing is punishing that animal.
Interesting.
Right? Because you're like, oh, I got calm. Now I'm going to give you an aversive event for being calm. I'm going to get closer. You're calm. Now I'm going to give you another aversive event for being calm. And so this poor animal has to work through all of this horrible, punishment basically, and settle down. And finally it'll relax and settle down. And then what do? You get closer. Whereas the cat, on the other hand, I'm calm. Hey, I get what I got anyhow. Person walked away. Oh, I got my growl. I got what my growl got me. Oh, look at that. Look at this. Look at the control I have over this. All I have to do is look at this person. They move away, right? I look at them now. And now they get a certain distance and, oh, I wonder what they're up to. Oh, now I can see. Oh, I can get food here now. And they discover new things. So when you put it in that context, you see that these things are not, in essence, defined by the procedure. Right? It's defined by the alternatives available to the organism and the control the organism has over their environment.
So again, it can't be linear.
Right. It can't be linear. Exactly right.
Linear.
And we should talk a little bit about what constructional means. And constructional means that I'm in the clinic when we walk in and someone comes in who says, oh, I'm very anxious, or I'm very depressed, or I've got these thoughts I can't deal with. And one approach would be, well, how do we get them less anxious? How do we control the thoughts? This type of thing. But a construction approach doesn't do that. Construction approach doesn't say we're going to eliminate your anxiety. We're going to say what needs to be established, the absence of which is anxiety. In other words, what are we going to work toward that produce what you value, what you're after? And when that's in place, the anxiety will no longer need to occur. So we're not going to deal with the anxiety directly, or the bad thoughts directly, or the hallucinations directly. That's my area of expertise, by the way, when I was in psychiatry. I worked with delusions and hallucinations and so on, and found the same principles worked, and we were quite successful with them. Even those with an organic ailment, like they came out of a disease process, we were able to work with. Dementia, cognitive decline, there's work in this area being done by investigators who are following the principles we laid out constructionally years ago. So the question is, when we ask a constructional approach, what do we need to establish, the absence of which is the problem? We're saying, okay, what is the animal's behavior that we need to establish, the absence of which results in them driving away the person trying to give them the medication? That if we put in place, the animal won't drive somebody away. Now, we're not trying to work on the driving away necessarily directly, right? We're giving them something else that'll have the same effect or produce the same consequence, but without the aversive consequences attached to it. That'll produce the same outcome. So we're always looking at what are we going to produce for the person or the organism that they're already getting in a way that solves the presenting problem. For a person coming into therapy, it's success in certain aspects of their life, or eliminating certain aversive behaviors that they have to go through in order to get the reinforcers they're after. And so a construction approach also then asks, okay, where are we at now? Where are we at, and where do we want to go? So we want to look at the environment as it stands and analyze what the current contingency ecology is for that person or organism. Okay, and say, okay, we're going to start here to get there. We're not going to require that either our patient or our animal behave here. Oh, we've identified you'd be better off if you do this. Well, you know what? If I could do that, I'd have been doing it. Right? And so that's not making any sense. And we call those single step procedures. Like, oh, you need to go this, and you need to do that. You get a prescription. Go home and do this. Yeah, well, yeah, okay. But so we say, okay, where are you almost successful now? where are you about, approaching doing this if we were to continue along this dimension, we'll reach that terminal outcome. And so those are our programming procedures. So those are the procedures, so the next thing. And then the fourth thing we look at is what is going to maintain the behavior through the program. One of the things that people often don't realize is that reinforcers, whether positive or negative, don't change behavior.
Ooh, okay, you have to elaborate.
It's the criteria we place for their delivery or availability that changes behavior. So in other words, we place criteria. Your butt has to hit the floor at a particular right time. When I say sit, right? The butt hits the floor, bing, that's it.
Okay.
It's the criteria. The food just maintain in this set of what we call changing criteria, right? It's called shaping in some cases. This program of changing criteria, what's known as a program. It's the programs that change behavior. Reinforcers maintain behavior through the programs.
That makes sense.
Right? It's the sequence of changing criteria that lead to a replicable outcome is what a program is. And so I have my procedures for training a dog to sit. It's the criteria, not the food that's doing it.
Yeah.
So this is what we have to learn to pay really close attention to is our criteria.
Yeah.
And so when I say look at the ecology of the organism, I'm not simply looking at that it gets food in its natural environment or whatever. I have to look at it and say, what does it have to do to get it? What are the criteria being placed on this organism? To move from one area to the other, what does it have to do in order to get there? What criteria? Stepping up a step is meeting a criteria, right? And so when I look at the world, whether clinically or in everyday sense, I'm not looking for consequences necessarily. I'm looking for the criteria. To make this light come on, I've got to flip the light at a certain force, or my light switch won't go on. That's criteria that's been placed in my behavior. To get the lid off a bottle of Coke with an opener, I have to put a certain amount of force to it to get that lid. So my behavior is being evaluated by that bottle cap. The criteria is being placed by that bottle cap. So that tells me that I have to look for criteria that are not necessarily imposed by another human. There are criteria that are imposed by humans. There are criteria imposed by the nature of tasks, right? By our apparatus and other things. So I have to be on the guard all the time for criteria. And it's the history and the sequencing of those criteria or the programs which then determine my behavior and the decisions I'm going to be making in my new context. So when someone says, oh, what's your history reinforcement? They say, well, I got this out of it and I got that out of it. Well, that's not as important to me as what did you have to do in the past to get that?
Yeah.
And so in a constructional approach, when we say maintaining consequences, we're looking at the maintaining part is the critical feature. In other words, how am I going to maintain the behavior through my program? What consequences are going to occur naturally as a result of the program? What requirements are going to occur that I can actually turn into conditioned reinforcers? And I do that by saying that each step, even though it was a challenge, gets you closer to your terminal outcome. It is getting you more other kinds of consequences as well. Then that just accomplishment step can be a reinforcer. Right? Yeah. So we say, oh, our animals learn to learn. They begin to enjoy doing this and so on. Well, what's happening is that the accomplishment is becoming a conditioned reinforcement. Hey, I found out that if I do certain things in a certain way with my trainer, it leads to reinforcement really fast, or a new thing, or a new environment. Right? Yeah. So it becomes what we call program intrinsically reinforcing. Not intrinsic inside the organism, but intrinsic to the programs. part of the program. And another term we call it program specific. In other words, there are consequences specific to certain programs. So when we look at these things, it sounds simple on the outset, but in the clinic, working with clients, it's we have to take those things into account as well, right?
Yeah, I like that because I think there's a tendency, at least in the animal community, and probably more so in the zoological community, because we're not living with our animals, people that live with their companion animals, there's a certain element of influencing behavior that's going on all day long to some extent. Whereas I think sometimes in the zoo community, there's this mindset of you go in, you have a training session with an animal, you deliver reinforcers, and then it's over.
Right.
And then there's no more influencing of behavior going on anymore.
Right.
But I think what you're saying right there is something maybe animal trainers in the zoo community need to think about a little bit more, so that when we have those animals, especially like the ones where we've used cat, and we may be influencing more than we know every time we're walking by, and how does that impact behavior in the long run? And we're not going to be just delivering food. How are we going to have that, that kind of behavior that we want, where the animal's feeling empowered and able to have that situation where we're not having fear responses all the time because we've used our constructional approach and gradually built up to the situation where now the animal's feeling like, I know how to handle this situation every time you're around without having to do reps of cat.
Exactly. And I think also, if I can get off on this topic a little bit of species typical behavior.
Sure.
What we fail to realize in species typical behavior, or sometimes called instinctual or fixed or modal action patterns, there's all kinds of words that you can use for it, inherited patterns, is that we see the behavior that's inherited or a fixed action pattern, but we don't often look at as the consequences. Those are also inherited. In essence, the species specific aggressive display occurs as what happens as a result of that is that there's a distancing created, right? Driving someone off or avoiding something or this type of thing. Submissive displays result in a similar type of thing that occurs if you're lower on the social hierarchy. What is actually being inherited, the most important thing, is the consequence of that pattern. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for it, right? The animals who give a scream when a predator flies over, right, of birds, and they'll be in this thing, they'll see a hawk fly over, rah, rah, and they mop, and the word goes out, right? Well, there are consequences attached that occur as a result of that. And so what we have to step back and look at and say, part of the criteria that we're looking at is what criteria are these species typical patterns fulfilling? It applies equally to them. And if we take another step back, there's an evolutionary biologist by the name of Ann Tierney who published a paper in the mid-1980s that was groundbreaking, where using neurological and other evidence that she had, made the suggestion that operant behavior preceded most species typical behavior. It's older. And the reason she said is, for that bird to give out that warning cry, a bird had to do it at one time first. Somebody had to do it first. In other words, behavior is selected once it occurs. Any morphological characteristic occurs. People say, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, of course, it's the egg, because that's where the variation was. All right? The variation was in the egg. The chicken hatches out of the egg. That variation is successful, live to reproduce, creates more eggs, right? So yes, the egg is the variation is where it occurred. So the notion then that she put forth is that what we saw is that these wider, highly variable behaviors, which produce critical life-sustaining consequences, the more they became more and more likely under those conditions, the more likely it was for that organism and that species to survive. And she talked about it as a product of through we're talking about evolutionary time here, not a lifespan, but, many, could be millions of years. You had a canalization of the behavior, meaning it took less and less and less to occasion it, and the consequence becomes immediate. In other words, it goes from a contingency to a dependency. And that it occurs, the consequence typically occurs every time. It's rare that it doesn't occur, right? And it occurs so much as one-to-one with it that we tend to think of it as a unit, not connected. But if you step back and look at the cat procedures, what you really are doing is you have species-typical anger and other attacks that are occurring across these different species that result in the distancing without the animal having being trained to distance. But if you give that same consequence, you can actually supplant that species-typical pattern with another pattern, but you're giving the animal the same evolutionary consequence. It's being more respectful to the animal to say, I am going to engage you in your own evolutionary context than it is to superimpose an external positive reinforcement of, a piece of chicken, which is not part of it. You're trying to suppress that pattern. So actually, you're much more in terms of level of least intrusive. You're least intrusive into the evolutionary, ecologically balanced world of that animal by utilizing those procedures, which may be referred to as negative reinforcement procedures in those contexts. Now, what you're not doing is creating an aversive stimulus. In other words, I'm not smacking an animal, and then in order for it to be relieved from this smacking, it then engages in other behaviors which are totally imposed by me and my criteria, right? So if I'm providing pressure from a choke chain, and to relieve that pressure, the animal has to do what I want it to do. Well, that is the type of aversive superimposition control that people are often complain about when they talk about negative reinforcement. Yeah. That's different than the ecologically respectful negative reinforcement that CAT and those procedures use.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about that spectrum that,
right.
Is there a benignness and a coerciveness within?
Right. There absolutely is.
Yeah.
And so the notion that, now we can use negative reinforcement, it's great. No. And we can use positive reinforcement, it's great. No.
I know. That's why I wanted to talk about this, because we have, these things out there where people are saying there's this hierarchy of procedures, yet it doesn't make sense to me because, it doesn't work that way. So that's why I wanted to hash this out with you, because I knew you would give me good insights, which you are.
It's what is the most ecologically sound procedure that will maximize, when possible, the degrees of freedom for the animal among alternatives, and allow the animal to have control over its environment in ways that it wouldn't have otherwise. What needs to be established, the absence of which is the problem here. And you don't have to, you're not going in making yourself aversive, to create the distance. That comes ready-made. That's built into the animal, right? It's not like a choke collar that you're tightening and then releasing when they do what they want, when you want them to do it. That's an entirely different set of conditions. An example that is in terms of positive reinforcement, and I saw this with Alex Kurlan working with a horse. Okay. And it stuck with me because it reminded me of a pigeon experiment that was done. And I've spoken about this when I've given talks before, and that is, she showed a horse being ridden in a corral, there was a circular corral that was going around this corral. And at a certain point of the turn, the horse, and she did a close-up of the horse's head, and you could see the horse grimace. It would kind of pull back, and you'd see it hesitate. And you look at the rider, and the rider's oblivious to this, right? And if the horse hesitates a little bit, you'd see the rider knees coming together, kicking it through just a little bit. Oh, come on, let's go through. And then sometimes the rider would reach down and pet, the horse or whatever and so forth. Well, what's happening here, of course, is that the horse is being nudged through this, either with reinforcement or punishment, I suppose, for not doing it, and so on, regardless of what it is that it cannot respond to the aversive stimulus being created by its turn at that point. And what she found out, that there was a problem with the knee. And it was creating a torque in the knee that was creating an aversive event this torque was something the horse, given an opportunity, would not do. But the reinforcement maintains its behavior through doing it. And so this is where positive reinforcement, an animal can be working right along and doing the behavior and going and working like crazy for positive reinforcement. But what's happened is you have basically suppressed the likelihood of these programmed intrinsic consequences, in this case sometimes aversive ones, of having their effect. So Nate Azrin and Holtz and Azrin did a series of experiments whereby they trained a pigeon to peck a key 50 times for food. Nothing particularly spectacular about that. Pigeons do that all the time. But what they did is they arranged to deliver a shock through a special harness to the pigeon for each key peck. So it's peck, shock, peck, shock, peck, shock, peck, shock, peck, shock, all the way up to the 50. At the 50th peck, food is delivered. Now, they also did it so that if the pigeon pecked and there was no shock, it meant no food. So when the pigeon pecked and got shocked, food would be delivered. Pecked, no shock, no food. Now, when the shock was turned off, the pigeon would fly into a rage. He'd be really upset. It'd go through all this type of aggressive behavior and so on if the shock was turned off. Once it's turned on, it got calm, happily went back to pecking. You could arrange it so that the shock is turned off. You peck this key, you turn it back on. The pigeon peck the key, turn the shock back on, and away they go. So these positive reinforcement contingencies are in place from the pigeon's point of view only if it's getting shocked. This is what I have to live through to eat. So it's peck, shock, get food. Peck, no shock, starve to death, is the pigeon's point of view, right? So they then arranged another key whereby you can peck 50 times and get food, no shock. Gave the pigeon a choice. Peck, shock, food, peck, get food. Pigeon is not crazy. It immediately switched to peck and get the food. But unless you gave it that alternative, the pigeon not only would get angry, if you will, show a distressful response if the shock was absent, it will work to turn the shock back on. So this is the nature of positive reinforcement in its ability, right, to coerce into a range of behaviors for which there could be intrinsic punishers going on as a function of that positive reinforcement. So one has to be very, very careful in looking at this. There's been work done where, for example, Ken Ramirez demonstrated work with some whales, I believe they were, where they would give them a hand signal to go out and do a routine, or the animal could swim just a few feet away, and there was a rubber ball that was attached to the side of the pool, and the animal would hit it with its nose, and they get the same fish. So they could either say, okay, I'm going to go do it, or I'm going to go hit the ball and get the fish. He called it a no response, but actually it was an alternative to doing the routine. So what interestingly they found is that experienced, well-trained trainers who gave good, clear, crisp commands, the animal always went out and did the routine. You got a sloppy trainer who gave unclear commands. In the absence of the red ball, the animal would do it. They would do the routine. Not that they couldn't do it, but when the red ball was there and that person was up there, the animal would go over and hit the red ball. No, I'm not going to do it for you. So it brought out consequences that could affect the animal's behavior that are not present. And it showed them that they had to work on the training techniques of certain individuals, and the animal did the evaluating. Right? The animal could evaluate whether that person was a really good trainer or not, gave the right types of signals, was on the ball. There was an aversiveness, in essence, to sloppy training, or sloppy trainer, rather, right? That only became apparent when an alternative way of getting the critical consequence, the fish, was made available. And so that's why when we say, oh, we're using positive reinforcement, look what we're doing, we train these animals and they do this and they can do these acts. And so, yeah, but don't forget, you could be masking other consequences as well.
I love that. Food for thought. This is the topic, right? When positive reinforcement can actually be coercive.
That's right. Something I work with children a lot, and that's why I'm not a big fan of, truthfully, these do this and you get that. Mm. And the question is, how do I program doing this as a conditioned reinforcer? How do I program, like, oh, you wash the dishes and I'll give you X? Well, how can I make having a clean pan a reinforcer? Is another something, a way I'd rather approach it. This is where giving kids choices and manipulating the environment and the criteria, the program, in essence, becomes the focus. For me, the focus is always on the program. That's how we taught. Our program was to teach children to read. We take a non-reading child to a mid-second grade level and 30 online hours of instruction with no teacher present. And we cannot hear or see the child. And yet we were successfully able to do this by paying very close attention to the program.
Ooh, now I want to take your reading program just so I can see how it was done. Well, I'm just super excited because you answered a lot of the questions that have been running around my brain for a while here about how do we think about these principles and how do they actually interact with one another. And so I don't know if it's all clear or more convoluted.
Could be. I could have made it a lot muddier waters here. But
I think that's a good thing. Even so, because I think the whole point of this conversation for me was to maybe open people's minds a little bit to thinking a little bit more about it, because it isn't really so black and white, and it isn't necessarily the step-by-step approach. So right. I want to thank you very much for doing that, Joe, and I hope you'll.
Well, it's a lot of fun and good seeing you again.
Yes, you too, and I hope you'll be open to maybe some more questions in the future.
All right, anytime. I'm primarily retired. I was doing a lot of traveling though before this. I'm on several boards and so forth, but now I'm just sitting here looking at the dog bark.
As we all are right now, I think. All right. Well, thank you so much, Joe, and I hope you stay safe and healthy out there.
Well, you too. Take care.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Okay, can you see why I'm such a super fan? He really is my favorite behavior analyst. He has got so much quality information and causes me to think in different ways about what we do, about the principles. And again, I think one of the important things he said at the beginning was about that whole concept that there's so much more that we don't know than we do know. And I love that point of view because it kind of reminds us that there's so much more for us to learn and keeps us humble, right? So I hope you enjoyed that episode. I certainly did. And I'm hoping that we can get Dr. Layng on here again, because I know I can never stop learning from him. Such a great resource for us and a wonderful human being on top of it all. Now I'm going to get into that question. And I thought it was actually kind of a good question considering the topics we were talking about. And this question has to do with harness training some male coatis that were rescued from the pet trade. And they're older animals, and the person says they're calm enough to handle, but unable to put a harness on them. Any suggestions for harness training? And the reason I think this is such a great question, based on the topics that we were talking about in that particular interview, is that I think one of the problems with harness training is that, and halters, any kind of device that you're trying to put onto an animal, is in general, we kind of think of those devices as a means for us to sort of control behavior, right? Keep animals manageable. But you can train those in a way so that they're not really so much controlling devices, but I kind of like to think of them as sort of a backup safety device, if you like. So what that means is I still want to train the animal to be a voluntary participant. It's not that I want to just get the device on the animal, and even if I do have it on the animal, how am I gonna work with the animal with that device on them? I kind of want to think of it like the harness or the halter is not even on the animal. I still want to think about, would that animal walk alongside me even if that wasn't on them? And so I'm still going to train the animal to walk alongside me or come back to me if I ask it to, and reinforce that action or that behavior. So when I think about even putting a harness or a halter on the animal, I try not to even think about it as how am I going to get it on the animal, but think about it more like, how is the animal going to get into the harness or the halter? Is there a way to teach the animal to put itself into the harness or the halter? And that first starts with the actual harness or halter. A first part of it is looking for the perfect harness or halter, one that's really easy for the animal to put itself into. And so, especially working in the exotic animal community, that means looking at a lot of different things, because typically there's not the perfect harness or halter out there designed for the species that you're working with. It might mean looking through catalogs for the agriculture community to find something that might work better than what you might see for dogs or cats. And you might find something that fits better. And I look for all different kinds of things. So if you're looking for the kind that might go over the animal's head, then you might look for things that have loops that are adjustable. And then I also try to look for things that don't have a lot of clips on them. I want something that maybe I only have to make one clip connect or one fastener connect. Another type that you might consider is the type that maybe you can spread it out so the animal puts its front paws in it, and then you lift it over the back and you just have to connect one thing on the back or two things on the back. And I also look for things that are adjustable so that I can make it really big at first, and then maybe over time I'm going to make it smaller so that it's a snugger fit later on. But having it bigger makes it, again, easier for me in the training process, so I can so that the animal it might be easy for the animal to put itself in and out of it, so to speak, and so my approximations can be really small. So that's all those things are going to affect your shaping plan depending on the type of device that you're able to get. But again, I always am looking for a halter or harness that's super easy for the animal to put itself into, so that I'm not manipulating body parts on the animal, because typically most animals are not too comfortable with that. And that's really what I'm trying to avoid. I want the animal to put itself into it. So then another part of the process might be creating a station that might make it easy for the animal to, again, be a voluntary participant. So some of the things we've done in the past with some animals is we've created stations that might be a little elevated. So if it's that kind of harness that's on the ground that the animal is going to step into, then that makes it super easy for their feet to be in just the right position. And we've already laid the harness on the ground, and all we have to do is teach the animal to be comfortable with us lifting those parts of the harness up and bringing it up over the animal's back. And maybe we have the animal put its nose on a target as well. And a great thing about that is if the animal is ever uncomfortable, all it needs to do is move away from the station or the target, and that lets us know not to proceed, right? So we can use that stationing behavior as good communication from the animal to tell us if it's okay to move on to the next step. And if you're using the kind of halter or harness that the animal can put its head through a loop, then you can teach the animal to voluntarily put its head through that loop. So that loop stays stationary. So maybe somebody's helping you and holds that thing steady in one spot, and you teach the animal to target its nose through the loop, or you can start with luring at first, and then that becomes a target. And then eventually what usually happens is the animal pushes its whole head right into that loop because it learns that earns desired consequences to put its head through there. So those are some of my really important tips about training harness or halter behaviors, is that it's about finding the right halter or harness. It's helpful to use a stationing behavior or targeting behavior to teach the animal position to be in, to make it a little bit easier. And it's really about teaching the animal to voluntarily put itself into that, and using that stationing or targeting behavior as a way to help the animal communicate to you whether it's comfortable or not with going on to the next step. So those are some tips to help you with that, to get you started on that. And of course, always remember too that it's not just about getting the device on, it's also about making sure the animal's comfortable with you taking it off. So keep that in mind. That's part of your shaping plan as well. And then also that once you have that device on there, that it's not about controlling the animal with it. It's just a backup safety device. So you also want to have a plan for teaching your animal to walk nicely alongside you. Kind of pretend like the harness or the halter is not on the animal. Can you recall the animal back to you when you need to? Work on that behavior as well. So hopefully those are some tips to help you with halter and harness training. And again, thank you all for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Joe Layng, and we'll see you next time here on the Animal Training Fundamentals podcast with Barbara Heidenreich. Take care, everybody. If you liked what you heard today, visit animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more quality content on animal training. You'll find courses, community, and extensive video examples from my consulting work around the world. We'd love to have you join our force-free family.